It is Wednesday, October 14th, 2020. I'm Pastor Thor Ramsey with Center Church. This is Gospel for Five, where we take 5 minutes out of our day, focus on the gospel and the one who saved our souls. We have been going through the book of Galatians, line by line, verse by verse. You could say that because that's what we're doing. All right, so yesterday we started in verse 13, where the Apostle Paul now is giving his background. He told us that Jesus Christ himself taught him this message. In other words, Jesus came to earth. He committed certain acts in history. And then, after he rose from the dead, he spent time with his disciples, including the Apostle Paul, explaining to them what his actions meant for humanity. Because that's what the gospel is about. It's not about only the teachings of Jesus, which are amazing. It is about what Jesus did in history that counts. That's really what the gospel is, what Jesus did. And Jesus spent time explaining what his actions meant. So Paul is now telling the readers about his former life in Judaism, how he persecuted the church of God violently. He tried to destroy the church. He didn't want this belief catching on. He didn't want these groups of people banding together and rising up. Well, maybe a message for today. Maybe Christians today should band together and rise up, since I believe our First Amendment rights are being trampled upon regarding the right to gather. I think it's clearly the case. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. I'm not going to get in a rant there, but churches should have never been shut down. Churches could have continued to function responsibly, even in the midst of a pandemic, and culture needs the salt and light of a church in its midst. Even though culture now diminishes the role of the church and mocks the role of the church, what culture does not realize is all the clout she has, or all the viewpoints she has right now. In other words, the energy she's running on came from the church in the culture. So that's another issue, but he didn't want these Christians rising up. He didn't want this message being spread. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So you can see he was zealous, he was passionate, he was a leader of leaders among his people. So extremely zealous I was for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born. So, now there you have it. This is, again, an undeniable teaching, the undeniable reality of the doctrine of predestination. It's a Bible reality. The word predestination is not used here, but that's exactly what he's talking about. When you say that God set me apart before I was born to do this, well, that's what you call sovereign grace. Is Paul going to deserve any of this? Does he deserve this calling? Does he deserve the grace and someone else doesn't deserve it? No, Paul doesn't deserve the grace. No one else deserves the grace. I don't deserve the grace. You don't deserve the grace. And yet God, in his sovereign grace, that's what we'll be looking at Sunday. But this is a huge issue for Christians. They really struggle with it. And I'll be talking about it Sunday, but part of the reason we struggle with it is the culture we live in. And we are all affected by the culture. We are products of our time, the culture in which we live, which, really emphasizes radical individualism, choice. You can be anything you want to be. You set your mind to it, etc., etc. The American dream type thing. And some of that actually comes from the Bible's teaching about the uniqueness of individuals and how God loves them each uniquely. So some of that actually comes from the scriptures, but we have so overemphasized that aspect of who we are in this country that we really struggle with any authority over and above us. So we'll really unpack that on Sunday, but here we have it. But when he who But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace, his unmerited favor. Paul did not deserve to be called as an apostle. God had his own purposes for the Apostle Paul's life. God has his own plan. So the Apostle Paul was part of that plan. That's why he was called by God. That's why he was set apart from before birth. Paul states it in Ephesians, before the foundations of the world. So it wasn't just at some point in time God made this decision, because God is all-knowing. So there can't be a point in time where God decides. God doesn't need to make decisions because he doesn't need to think things through. God doesn't need to reason things through because he's all-knowing. So it all plays together, and it all comes out to this doctrinal reality of we were all predestined in the plan of God. And if we struggle with that, we'll check out Sunday's sermon. All right, what has God said to you today? What do you